So yeah, spoiler alert, this is AI related, so if you aren't interested in that, sorry. But GPT-3 was down as of like half an hour ago, so I'm gonna make sure it's still working. If not, I have some videos because I prepared well for this. Yeah. So yeah, we're talking about spatial interfaces, spatial canvases, and large language models. Sorry. Let's just do a little. Okay, maybe it's still broken. Oops. Okay, well, we'll start with this. Hi everyone, I'm Max. I work for Matt. This is our website. We're also hiring right now, so talk to me after if you're interested. But yeah, so this is kind of a talk on, I do research into interacting with language models in this kind of like 2D spatial canvas environment. So by this point, I imagine a lot of people will have interacted with GPT-3 or some kind of language model in some way, but for those who haven't, this is what the page that it shows if your authentication is not working, but if it's back up, then yeah, okay, yeah. So this is kind of the generic interface you get. They call it the playground at OpenAI. You write down something. It can be a question. It can be also an instruction. So you can say, you command it to write the name, and it'll give you kind of like a random thing. But yeah, so this is obviously useful, and for those of you who've played with these, there's lots more things you can do with them other than just like asking where famous people work. But there are some inherent limits to this kind of like text in, text out interface. Obviously, you can call this via APIs and build stuff on top of it, which is interesting. But if you're kind of conforming yourself to this text only interface, then there's some inherent limits. But one of the ways you can get out of that is kind of bringing the language model tool into this like spatial canvas type situation. So this is for Matt. It's a spatial canvas that is end user programmable. That's also our big thing. So you can basically like write code. Here I wrote this little code, and this is our little bespoke programming language. So it's like, okay, if this is 7 long, then it's going to change the background into the hex code. So if you type a hex code, it changes. All kind of like there's parameters, backgrounds, colors, sizes, positions that you can update via code. You can update via like manually typing it in. But because it is end user programmable, you can also write API calls into it. So I think because it was down, we started using the worst version of GPT-3. So this might be wrong. Yeah, so it's going to start talking about the Douglas Engelbart organization. But yeah, we did that because DaVinci was down. We're using Curie now. But yeah, so this is the basic kind of interaction you can have with it. It's essentially just a cool port of the idea of text in, text out into the spatial canvas. So if this were I had other people on the document multiplayer, I could be like, oh, look at this cool thing that I found. You can edit it. It's text. It's whatever. But basically, yeah, so this is limited and useful in a lot of the same ways that the playground is limited and useful. But something that we kind of like started thinking about it from Matt is, what if you combine this idea of like spatial querying, asking questions essentially of different parts of the canvas with this like language model thing. So this is something that I built a while ago. This is this little sentiment painter. So asking GPT-3 to just do some sentiment analysis, like very basic stuff. But then it kind of like paints the text box with an equivalent color with what it is. And so this kind of like creates a little to get like metaphorical about it. This creates like a little bubble of like sentiment analysis goop around it that when you bring things towards it, it'll do whatever operation you have. In this case, it's sentiment analysis. Here's another tool. This is not a video this is kind of, this takes as an input whichever things are around it. So you can see, we'll see, what's the similarity between night and a cloudy day? They're both dark. Okay, cool. What's the difference between night or the similarity between night and a panther? Oh, they're both mysterious and intriguing. What about a race car? Stealthy. Okay, maybe not a race car, but so this is basically kind of, there's, and to get like really metaphorical about what this is doing is you can imagine it as creating this kind of like hidden layer, also like a 2D in 2D space that is kind of populated with the semantic similarities between different blocks, different text. In this case it's just text boxes, but you get paragraphs or things like that. But it creates kind of a map of those, underneath, above it, in the kind of 2D space. And this tool, as you drag it around, kind of like drags that 2D map of like similarities. Again, we're on the worst the worst GPT-3 model here, but let's see if it gets it right this time. Large and majestic. Okay. But so kind of like takes what exists in that layer of maybe spatially, here there exists the concept of speed. Oh no, that's the wrong one. Here, in this part of the canvas, there exists the concept of speed, or and so if you bring this over, it kind of so it brings that to the horizon. So that's like kind of like a really basic implementation of this. And so this is working with language models. This is a kind of interaction that you can't get with a text, like a linear kind of like text editor type interface or something like that. So you can also designate kind of like specific zones of the canvas to be like spatially aware. So you can, this is a part of your document, that you're working in, this kind of, analysis courtyard, and you can basically, drag things into it and compare them. And obviously, we know what the differences between cats and fish are, but if we have, like, for example, some, like, paragraphs that are, about things, you can have, so obviously there's a lot of text, you probably don't want to read that, but there are, you can make these kind of like spaces that exist within your document that kind of spatially can like do operations. And I'm not really focusing on like the use cases, comparing the two paragraphs is kind of like a simple thing, but it's this idea that you can have different like zones you've designated to like do different tasks. And there's, I think we have a lot of, a tendency to kind of like group like things. People like doing that, and so this is kind of like, maybe you have all your notes on one thing in one part of your notebook, or you have all your sketches for like a kind of painting that you want to put on your wall, and like, and Post-its on the wall or something like that. So this is kind of like, and that behavior kind of can extend to your note-taking or your productivity apps, whatever, as well. And so this is kind of like yes-anding that. It's like, okay, if you're putting all of these things, maybe it's an abstract for a paper you're reading in one spot because you want to look about it or think about it later. You also have, can do this kind of analysis on it. Or, again, lots of useful things you can do with language models. But it's this kind of like spatial bit that I particularly find interesting. And so from these kinds of interactions, you can start to build like some more interesting stuff. So this is something I built. This is kind of like a live writing thing. So you can kind of like basically drag and drop and connect these tools to your, and again, it's a lot of text, apologies, but you can basically like, drag and drop these tools to your writing environment in this kind of like physical interface. So if you're writing something, and then you can, if you're writing, you can, I'm just gonna copy what I have written down in my notes. So you can see, actually no, I'm just gonna write this until it updates. But basically imagine I'm like writing because I can't talk and then also think about something to write at the same time. But eventually I've written enough, that it starts to like, kind of like live update. And so these, these kinds of like, this kind of that idea of like, intelligence augmentation as opposed to productivity augmentation. Like, sure, I could just generate something that finishes this blog post or thought or whatever I'm doing. But something that's more interesting is, potentially getting like a live counter argument to what you're writing. So you can, it's probably bad because again we're using Curie instead of DaVinci. But in theory you have this thing that can kind of like work with you while you're working the document. And obviously this is kind of like you might not always want these, so you can they don't have to be attached to anything. But there's also there's like there's a style transfer that you can do. So I'm writing something down and I want to, I'm going to go to the park. And I want to, do some whatever stuff. You can kind of have this like physical, it's going again. There's this kind of like physical interaction. You can like, drag this idea of floweriness or this idea of professional to this part of the document to have it work for, and things like that. There's also these other tools that are kind of fun that are like this is kind of like a yes and a tool that kind of like does like follow-ups to you via like a little bit of like a chaining interaction. Also, should I zoom in? Is that? I'll zoom in. So this kind of like, ask, it's like, oh, here's some like other ideas that could go. This kind of basically just asks for counter arguments and then asks for counter arguments again. So, to preempt your, so it gives you some potential rebuttals if you like. And this is, again, like maybe I'm writing and I'm really concerned with what people are going to write about me. And so I'm going to have this open because I, don't want to get roasted or something. Maybe I'm feeling too arrogant and I want to, attach a harsh critique kind of, situation to my thing. So it'll find the main point of my, oh God, that's really, it'll find the main point of what I'm writing and kind of, attack that. But yeah, depending on what I'm writing, kind of like, this kind of like drag and drop kind of interface that also, I didn't really demonstrate it well, but as you're writing, it will live update. And this is kind of the kind of like, what's it called? The kind of like a logical dropping off point for the combination of like end user programming and spatial canvas and language models is this kind of like chaining thing. So there's lots of things that exist for chaining. There's LangChain. There's Dust does that. But this I think is kind of cool. Is that with like Informat with like a little bit of grouping and some buttons and some emojis, you can make like a little bit of like a UI. And so this is like this little interface I made where you can like link some things up. Let's say you get the weather for a given city, and you can do something dumb like write a haiku. So let's see what the weather is in London. And so you can basically you run it here. The weather API gets the weather. It unfortunately sucks, and then this writes a haiku about the weather. Again, the use case is not the important bit, but it's the idea that you can have these kind of tools and these cards that do things all kind of like within your workspace, and that you're working with them. It's this kind of like Lego block thing. So I can clear this if I want. I can drag in this little dumb what should I wear thing. Let's see what the weather is. I'm from Chicago, so we'll say what is the weather in Chicago. Okay, it's really cold and cloudy, and so yeah, scarf and a jacket. I can I can have a little summarized headline bot, and then I can get the top 5 headlines for today in like a different category. So I link these up, and then the idea too is that because these are like language models, they're really easy to make your own tools for. So it's just essentially the idea of like you can copy and paste one of these and literally just change the prompt into something. But yeah, what is it? Let's see what the environmental news is today. It's probably great. Did that work? Let's try politics. It's probably better. Okay, yeah, that worked. Yeah, so this, you get the headlines. There's lots of this is all U.S. So it's about there's lots of stuff about the mayor's race in Los Angeles. But what if it was and there's also this kind of like composability thing. So maybe it was Steve Legend instead that is wishing someone a. Okay, well that didn't go. But yeah, so you can change these kind of as well. You can kind of interact with them between the within the chain. So again, there's this idea that you can having your tools kind of out in front of you, building workflows and stuff. This is probably more of a prototyping app or something like that than an actual production ready thing. You don't obviously need a spatial canvas for this. But yeah, so this is just like a thing you can make. Yeah, so this is kind of a brief overview of what I've specifically been doing in the intersection of 2 dimensions and language models, which is again kind of a one-dimensional kind of thing. And yeah, this is just obviously also just one subset in the field of this kind of human AI interaction idea. But yeah, there's a lot more to explore here. I think there's a lot of cool stuff. Are we doing questions? If there's questions, you can ask them. But if not, come hang out. We're also hiring according to my boss.
Yeah, find Max off if you want to ask questions. We don't have Hamish.
While I'm getting ready.